explain a little bit about why I should even be sitting here talking to you, and why I'm qualified to do that, if I'm qualified to do that. A few years ago, my wife and partner and I organized land that we owned in Hawaii as a nonprofit that could be turned into a botanical garden. And this is a unique botanical garden in that our focus is on psychoactive plants and plants with a history of shamanic usage. And even though we're a very modest effort, it turns out we're the only people in the world, as far as we can tell, who are actually doing this. You're all aware of the speed at which the rainforests of the world are being cleared, but what is never mentioned is the even more rapid disappearance of folk knowledge about the rainforest. I'm an optimist, and I believe that eventually the rainforest clearing will be halted, and there will be huge preserves in the tropics. But nothing will halt the homogenization of human knowledge and the abandonment of localized ancient folkways in favor of the kind of generic kinds of understanding that operate in the world cultural market. In the next 30 years, it's going to be the last opportunity that we will have to preserve 50, 100,000 years of folk medical knowledge relative to the tropics. So this is the real world political work that my wife and I do, and Kat runs it on a day-to-day basis. I'm its spokesman, but she does the grunt work and the organizing, and organizes the expeditions and the collections. If any of you are of a philanthropic bent, this is something I would be interested in discussing with you on our own. For the rest of you, I simply want to inform you that this kind of effort is going on. If you find yourself in exotic foreign countries or planning to travel to remote tribal areas, we would be interested in signing you up to help in our collection efforts. I believe that the collecting and preserving of these psychedelic and psychoactive plants is equivalent to the preserving of ancient manuscripts that was done in the Dark Ages, preserving things we don't understand toward a brighter day when society will create an open enough climate of inquiry that these things can actually then be looked at. Well, so much for that. As far as my qualifications, they're pretty minimal in the academic realm. I have a degree in conservation of natural resources from the University of California, Berkeley, which is a little like saying, I have a degree in tap dancing from the University of Antarctica. But from the time that I was a very small child, I was an edge runner. And I don't know why, but this turned out to be a very fruitful natural style for getting ahead in the world. The exploration of edges, the oldest books, the forgotten countries, the unpronounceable islands, that sort of thing. And I was a rock collector and a butterfly collector and an amateur rocketeer and all these things. And when I analyzed these pursuits of mine, it was the pursuit of a certain flash of iridescence, the iridescence that you get when you break open ore-bearing rock, or the iridescence that you get when you capture certain kinds of butterflies in tropical environments, or the kind of iridescence that you get when you mix potassium perchlorate and sugar in a hot sauce pan and ignite it. In other words, pushing out at the edge of the permissible, at the edge of the probable, looking for a certain something, a scintilla, a spark, a possibility. And as I matured and became a goggle-eyed chess master and hell-on-wheels science fair competitor, I came to understand, I came to assimilate the methodology of science, which is not particularly at the top of its share of the market at the moment. But I assimilated that, and I discovered the second part of the method that has been so serviceable to me, which is the good stuff can take pressure. The good stuff doesn't have to be looked at sideways. In other words, if something is real, you can stress it. You can test it. It doesn't require belief. This was, for me, a great intellectual watershed. The understanding that belief of any sort was a kind of encumbrance to the relationship that I was attempting to have with what I naively called reality. That was the thing. And eventually, this strategy of edge running led me into psychedelics. I had had the good fortune to make my way to the University of California at Berkeley. So I was at, this was 1965, I was at ground zero of the impending cultural implosion. My good fortune. But at that point, discovering psychedelics, I realized that not only the tired cliche that everything you know is wrong, but also that whatever is true cannot even be imagined. And since I discovered this on my own, I don't feel under any kind of constraint not to talk about it. I wasn't initiated by any secret society. Nobody swore me to silence. So I seem to have gotten through a number of filters. I feel perfectly empowered to talk about this thing which I think nobody is supposed to talk about. And I don't mean the legal side of it or the social side of it. I mean, that barely interests me at all. Who cares? I mean that the world we are living in is not at all as the linguistic structures we have inherited would have us have it. That we are actually living inside some kind of artificial construction which is potentially permeable by human understanding, but to date has not been. We have been very much on the surface of things. The question that I raise constantly with myself, and it's interesting to talk about it with other people then, is, just what is going on? Just what do you think is going on? I mean, have you backed off from it? Do you have a grip on the outlines of the problem? Or are you just sort of adrift inside the context? Because the situation is mighty peculiar, friends. What we have here is a kind of creature made out of information, apparently loose in an environment of meaning, on the surface of a planet upon which gene swarming is happening. And all of these things, gene swarming, self-reflection, production of epigenetic codes like writing and this sort of thing, have no precedent. We don't go out and collect other forms of these things. They all are generated out of us. We, as moderns, as inheritors of Cartesian rationalism, look out at a universe that our science tells us is energy, matter, conservation of mass and momentum, and yet we never notice the peculiar enigma posed by the question, who's looking? Who's looking? How is it possible that the coextensive continuum of apparent being is coordinated inside organism into an experience of ongoing becoming with which we have some kind of identification. This is very weird. It should provoke more comment than it is. I think it's fairly easy to compress the entire history of philosophy into the process of achieving age 8. By age 8, most of us, if we have the time on our hands, are able to carry out an analysis of being where we reach the conclusion that everything is events in the nervous system. We understand this. We understand that light being reflected from objects then creates neurochemical events which reconstruct an image of the outer world. So we pay lip service to this idea that everything is a neurological event. But in fact, we have a very strong faith in the so-called three-dimensional Newtonian world. And yet, this is the faith that can be deconstructed on psychedelics. It shows us something which we give lip service to, but which is very hard to raise to the level of a felt experience. And that is that the world is made of language. It is made of language. This is not, something you say at sales meetings to boost sales. This is bedrock, as far as I can tell, and everything else is unconfirmed rumor. Well, then, what is language? What is it, if the world is made out of it? Well, then this becomes dicey, because the tool for describing language is language. And, you don't have to have graduated to Logic 3 to understand that there's a self-limiting program involved in something carrying out a complete description of itself. It's a tautology. It can't be done. Does that mean then that language can only be understood from the vantage point of the unspeakable? I think so. We didn't know what that meant. We thought the unspeakable was like silence. That isn't what it is. The unspeakable is the ground of language. Well, how did we get into this situation? This is part of the question that relates to what is going on. How did we get into this situation? If you came in a flying saucer and observed the Earth, I think you would come to the conclusion that the breakout process or the anomaly in the mix is the human element. Animals of all sorts have existed on this planet, integrated into all kinds of ecosystems, and only in the phenomenon of human beings do you get this breakout away from genetics, away from the raw transmission of hereditary characteristics, and into a whole new realm of being, a whole new ontos of possibility, which is epigenetics, codes, self-generated, language, song, dance, painting, chanting. All of these things are forms of expression, but they are not genetic expression. What seems to be happening on this planet, at least, and in the universe generally, is a conservation of complexity, a speeding up of process, and a conservation of complexity. Now, the ordinary theory of evolution is thought to be a theory that is confined within the domain of biology. It's a theory of how one organism supersedes another and there is advancement of form. But scientists are very nervous when you extend the concept of evolution to the inorganic universe at large. And yet, if you think about the life of the universe, as we all have learned it from Carl Sagan, you know that we all began as an infinitely small, dense, hot dot But that didn't last long, because there wasn't much going on, because there was so much energy that no arrangements could be made. Then there was a massive explosion and a tremendous drop in temperature. And at that point, atomic, free atoms, electrons could settle into orbits around atomic nuclei, and you get atomic chemistry, which condenses into stars made of pure hydrogen and helium, which cook out iron and carbon. You get more complex chemistry with more complex bond possibilities. This allows the molecular bond to form for the first time. Suddenly, an entirely new universe of possibilities springs into being. And at the end of that cascade of possibilities is organic life. Organic life then contorts and conserves information and folds it in upon itself and replicates it and distorts it, and you get more and more advanced forms of higher plant organisms, plants, and animals. Ultimately, this process ushers into human beings with culture, electronic culture, and then finally the cataclysmic connectedness of the 20th century. From a psychedelic point of view, this is all a connected process. You see, the Newtonian scientific thing lifted human beings out of the center of the cosmos properly and set them off to one side. Small planet, small star, small galaxy, to one side. And that may have been a refreshing dose of realism to the monotheistic ego that had been created out of the medieval eschatology. But in a way, it's unsatisfying, because the felt presence of experience has a centrality to it. I mean, we do feel that we are important, at least to ourselves. Well, can we create a metaphysic that is true to what is observed of the universe and true to our intuition? Yes, we can, if we see history as the inheritor and the culminating process of all these other processes. And then, if we see ourselves installed at the cutting edge, at the leading edge of history, as its major players and actors. And this is, in fact, the situation. I mean, have you ever stopped to consider how many people didn't screw up for you to be sitting here tonight? You know, your ancestors, how many times there were opportunities for, the saber-toothed tiger to strike back, or the hunt to fail, or the fever to sweep through, or the breast to go dry, or how many times were there opportunities that somebody had their eye on the ball, somebody paid attention? You are the inheritor of that process. There's a lot of talk in the New Age, schmage, about the Tao of the ancestors, or Tao. Well, what does the Tao of the ancestors mean, except that you are the rearranged genetic component of your particular genetic stream, and your grandfather, your great-uncle, your grandmother, your great-aunt had ways of doing things. Pitting peaches, planting beans, trimming flank steak. That's the Tao of the ancestors, that there's a way to do things. And that when you do things that way, that is the appropriate way for you to do it. And you can tell it's the appropriate way because there is very little energy loss. That's what the Tao is. It is appropriate activity. And from a psychedelic point of view, when we analyze the state of the world, what we see is not that there are many problems, sexism, racism, air pollution, monotheism, you name it, not that there are many problems, but that there's really just one problem. The problem is, well, it can be defined many ways, but it's basically that we are inappropriate to ourselves. We are ill with ego. We have a narcissism that we cannot put down. Why? Why, given what we know about evolution and how it tries to smooth the way, why do we have a maladaptive relationship to reality? It doesn't make any sense. Well, here's why. It's nobody's fault, first of all. It has to do with the fact that the monkey is lagging behind the dynamics of the planet. 3 million years ago, we were happy in the trees of Africa, in the canopied tropical equatorial forests of Africa. And in the way of planets, there are long cycles of drying and aridification. And a cycle like that began in Africa. And these arboreal primates, which had a social form and a complex kind of pack signaling, they were fruitarian and highly specialized at it, came under environmental pressure because of the retreat of these rainforests and their replacement by grasslands. When an animal comes under environmental pressure like that, it has to expand its diet or face extinction. It's just that simple. Now, to my mind, the great unexamined dynamic of evolutionary theory is diet, especially when we discuss human evolution. Why? Works like this. These monkeys are under pressure to expand their diet. Therefore, they must experiment with new kinds of food. When you experiment with new kinds of food, you are opening yourself up to exotic chemicals and mutagenic compounds present in plants in your environment. Plants produce these things to ward off predation, discourage insects, attract pollinators, various reasons. But chemically speaking, the very compounds which are pheromones, sexual attractants, or poisons are also in the chemical families that impact on human physiology. Alkaloids, steroids, hormones, neurotransmitters, and yes, psychedelic drugs. These things are all present in the diet. Well, the peculiar way in which we differ from the other primates, speaking generally, is that we have what are called neonatal characteristics. The persistence of infantile characteristics into adulthood is typical of human beings. This is why we have this extremely long period of semi-non-functionability. Up to age 16 or something, you're not fully all there, you know. This is incredible for an animal. This means we're almost like kangaroos. You know, when the kangaroo is born, it's 1/8 of an inch long. It lives in the mother's pouch. It's actually out of the body in practically maggot form. And our hairlessness and our large skull and numerous characteristics are neonatal and were probably induced by mutations, alkaloids and things like that in the diet. The one I want to particularly call to your attention is psilocybin, because here is the scenario of human emergence, and I defy anyone to top it. This is how it happened. Here's how the boar ate the cabbage, or something. Part of this pressure to expand diet had to do with abandoning vegetarianism and turning on to the fact that there were huge amounts of protein on the hoof in these grasslands in the form of ungulate mammals that were developing in the same environment. So these pack-hunting primates began to take an interest in these ungulate mammals and, hunt them, club them, or predate on carrion kills by lions and that sort of thing. And when they did this, of course, if you follow herds of ungulate animals, you see a lot of what the president calls deep doo-doo. And in this, you encounter mushrooms. The technical term is